Welcome back to another video. We are still talking about the age of absolutism, and this time specifically Prussia. If you recall the last lecture video that we did, or the last class that you were in that we talked about, we spoke about Prussia, but we were leading up to it through the 30 Years' War. Because after the 30 Years' War is when Brandenburg becomes a part of Prussia, and it becomes Brandenburg-Prussia, and that's really when Prussia starts becoming a superpower in Europe. Arguably, they were the strongest nation in the 18th century Europe. But we're going to look at that a little bit more closely. So let's get started. Like I said, Prussia is going to emerge, and what's important to remember is Prussia is going to emerge as a Protestant power, while Austria was molded as a Catholic state. So you can look at the map here. You see Prussia's right in this little dark gray area, and Austria's right here. Alright, so you could already know that there's going to be some problems because, again, whenever you have a nation close by you that has different beliefs and a different way of ruling and a different way of thinking, and specifically the Catholic Protestant power, you're going to get into a lot of battles and a lot of wars. And you're going to see that in the different wars that we're going to look at today, where Austria and Prussia are always getting into heated battles with one another and never really allies. So Prussia's Protestant, and that's easy to remember. Prussia, Protestant, starts with a PR, right? And Austria is more Catholic. The first Frederick that we're going to talk about, because during this time, almost every ruler or important person in Prussia is going to be named Frederick something. Frederick this, Frederick that. And this Frederick is Frederick William, nicknamed the Great Elector. Now, he was not a king, but he was the father of Prussian absolutism. You don't really have to worry about differing between all these different Fredericks. It gets way too confusing. You could kind of think of them as a collective whole. This is the Fredericks dynasty. Now, Frederick William I is nicknamed the Soldier King, and aptly so, because he wanted to have an extremely strong military. And when a nation wants to have a strong military, that is called militarism. Very easy to remember. Militarism is the belief and the strong desire for a country to have a super strong army. Now, let's see if he actually accomplished that feat. Well, Prussia had the 12th largest population in Europe. So they were not the biggest country. They were not the biggest state. They were not the biggest even in the Holy Roman Empire. But they have the 4th largest army. Think about that for a moment. You have the 12th largest population, but the 4th largest army. That's pretty impressive. That means a handful of your Prussian people, your citizens, are becoming part of the army. Very few of them would not be a part of the army. Frederick William is going to be doing an excellent job at recruiting people in, at stirring up nationalism and bringing people into his army. Now, Frederick William's described as extremely serious and very disciplined. In fact, he's so serious and so disciplined that he's like your stereotypical man's man. He banned operas, he banned ballets, comedies, and other arts, essentially calling them soft. He didn't want anything to do with them. So again, if you picture your stereotypical man, broad-chested big man with deep voice, I'm not going to the ballet, I'm not going to go to that play, I'm not going to Broadway. He essentially called all those things soft and he banned them. Ultimately, he wanted to be the opposite of Louis XIV. If you remember Louis XIV, he was all about the arts. He was all about the luxuries. He made the palace at Versailles beautiful, had all this luxurious stuff around him, and people actually thought that he was a bit militaristic. But Frederick William I is the exact opposite. He said, I'm the Soldier King. I'm going to ban this. I'm a man. It's all about war, war, war. Strong, strong, strong. And so he is kind of the right guy, because of his demeanor and because of his personality, to make Prussia into a strong militaristic state. And he does just that. It's during this time that the Prussian drill model becomes world-renowned. And an interesting fact about that you're going to end up learning in United States history when you cover George Washington and the Revolution and all that, is Baron von Steuben, who came over from Prussia, would actually help George Washington instruct American soldiers in the Prussian model. Essentially, Baron von Steuben would take the Prussian playbook and go over and coach George Washington's men. He would coordinate them. He would teach them the proper way to do these drills, all in a Prussian style. So that just goes to show just how popular and world-renowned the Prussian army at this time was. Now, another interesting fun fact that's often talked about when you're discussing Prussia and Frederick William I is he really liked tall men for his army. Yeah, it sounds bizarre. It sounds weird, but he did. And they were called Potsdam Giants, another key term. And essentially, Potsdam Giants are just that. They are really tall men that are in the army. Now, interestingly, he very rarely actually had these guys fight. They were more for show. They were more for, let's see how many really tall guys we could dress up in a nice uniform. So there's a little bit of weirdness going on there, but it does show you, though, that Frederick William's entire life was surrounded by the army and surrounded by increasing militarism in Prussia. And it does work. Again, they had the 4th largest army when they've only had the 12th largest population. And here are a couple pictures of the Potsdam Giants in their nice uniforms. Nice and crisp, really big hands, really big people, all right? So if you would look around you and you see people that are like 6'5", 6'6", 6'7", basically everybody in the NBA or even college basketball, or perhaps even on your basketball team, any of those guys would probably be eligible for becoming Potsdam Giants and being put into the service, oftentimes forcefully. There was actually a running joke in Prussia at this time, from what I heard anyway. Whether or not it's accurate is another story, but it's funny anyway, so I'm going to tell it, is that one way that parents would kind of tease their child would be to say, oh, you better stop growing, little boy, because you keep growing tall enough, the king's going to come and snatch you up. Kind of creepy if you ask me, but that was the whole idea of the Potsdam Giants, is if you're tall, you're going into the army, Potsdam Giant. Now, Frederick the Second is Frederick William's son, and he is like the exact opposite of his father for the most part. As a child, he's gifted musically. He loves music. He loves the arts. He loves French literature, but his dad hates it. And they had such a bad relationship with one another, at least from what we can tell, that Frederick the Second, who later on becomes Frederick the Great, actually ran away. He wanted to run to England because he had a relative there who was in power. He wanted to run away with a friend or two of his to England, but he was caught, and his dad, Frederick William, the disciplined Potsdam Giant recruiting man, ended up making Frederick II watch his friend who helped him get executed in front of him. Now, of course, Frederick II wasn't executed, but he was thrown in prison for a little bit of time in order for him to learn his lesson. But that's the kind of man that Frederick William was. And so when he sees that his son is more about music and more about the arts and not this man's man, and he's trying to run away, he's going to teach him a lesson. And he does. And you know what? It works out, at least for Prussia. I don't know how Frederick II felt later in life, but he did end up staying, and he did end up doing a lot of the things that his dad would want him to. So it seems like, for the most part, he did all right, and then he ends up becoming Frederick the Great. But he's considered to be an enlightened absolutist. And enlightenment is something that we're going to talk about in a few classes from now when we kind of wrap up the age of absolutism. But they are going on around the same time, right? In this 18th century Enlightenment thinking of being more about the arts and more about individual freedoms and thinking and less about religion and just being more rational. Those ideas are permeating Europe during this time. And we're going to look at that. But what you need to know right now is that an enlightened absolutist, such as Frederick the Great, ultimately what that means is he wants to apply the principles of the Enlightenment to his reign, to his rule. And there's a nice, helpful acronym for that. and that's trap. So what kind of policies does he want? Well, he wants toleration of religion, reform institutions, absolutism, that should be a given, and patronage of the philosophers/arts. In other words, he'll go and he'll give money to people so that they can do their art, that they can do their music, something that he wasn't able to do because his father forbade it. So that's a helpful little acronym to remember what an enlightened absolutist kind of is, specifically Frederick the Second. He ends up tolerating more religion. He ends up reforming a lot of the institutions from education to government with his civil service reform. He's an absolutist still. He's not giving up his power. It's not a democracy. He's still in power. And he's also funding some philosophers and some arts, specifically a guy like Voltaire. He ends up becoming known as a friend of Voltaire and gives him money to help Voltaire write. And he considers himself to be the first servant of the state, meaning he was actually concerned about his people. And you could go online and find pictures of him in farms, in farmers' fields, inspecting some of the crops to let them know what was good and what was bad, specifically potatoes, because it's during Frederick II's reign that potatoes are actually introduced to Prussia. And potatoes are very good foods for any nation because they're really high in calories. So that allows people to not starve to death when you're getting a lot of calories out of one crop, right? And like I said, Frederick II loves the arts and he likes music, but he was constantly, as a child, forbidden to do those things. Now, one of the things he did at a fairly young age also is he actually argued against Machiavelli's ideas of how a prince, how a ruler should rule. And that's pretty notable because if you remember when we read parts of The Prince, Machiavelli's work, he believed that the prince should do anything necessary to get his people under his control. You know, even lying if he has to, basically exerting his control and making sure that they all know I'm the man in charge. But Frederick II was kind of the opposite of that. Some people say that when he actually got into power, he wasn't, but for the most part, his ideas were to actually be a man of the people, and so he allowed for what's known as meritocracy. Now, meritocracy is easy to remember because the word merit is in it. In other words, he allowed people to get government jobs by their own merit. You didn't have to be born into nobility. You didn't have to be born into some type of job. Instead, regular people can actually work in government. Doesn't matter if you're Catholic or Protestant, though he obviously favored Protestants. Meritocracy to him meant that anybody could work in the government. Regular person or noble, doesn't matter. And it's during his time that two big wars are going to happen. The War of Austrian Succession is when he invades Silesia, which was under the Habsburg control, and he ends up claiming it for Prussia. So that's going to become a big issue because obviously Austria next to him isn't going to like that. Now, Austria and the Holy Roman Empire are in a succession crisis, thus the War of Austrian Succession, because Charles VI, who was the emperor of this time and in charge of Austria, only had two daughters, and many people were not okay with them becoming heirs to the throne, specifically becoming in charge of the whole Holy Roman Empire. And Maria Theresa, one of his daughters, is actually going to take the throne in the same exact year that Frederick the Great becomes the ruler. So Frederick the Great, Frederick II, really thinks that this is his time to conquer, to go. And so that's when he takes over Silesia. So he kind of takes advantage of this succession crisis going on because a lot of people in the Holy Roman Empire don't like that Maria Theresa's there. Now, in addition to that, he gets involved in the 7 Years' War, which in American history it would be called the French and Indian War. But that's really just a continuation of the Austrian Succession, and it can really be called the first truly global war. Now, here's a map here. You can then tell Prussia's right here, Silesia's right there. So they're going to extend their power and take this over. And again, this border here, this purple line, is still the Holy Roman Empire. And you have a lot of problems in there because they don't like that Maria Theresa's succeeding her father. And here you have the 7 Years' War map. Again, this is North America, right? War took place over there. And this is Europe. War took place over there. So you have a bunch of different places where that war is going on. Now, some of his accomplishments. He made Prussia stronger due to militarism. He expanded Prussian territory by capturing Silesia. And he even reduced censorship and increased religious toleration. And this is how you can build an absolute state.